The warm scent of apple pie wafted through the air, mixing with the faint earthy smell of rain on the front porch. Katie hesitated, her hand hovering over the brass doorknob. Her heart thudded in her chest, so loud she was certain her parents could hear it through the door. The place she had once called home stood before her, every creak and crack of the familiar wooden frame whispering memories she'd long tried to forget. Yet today wasn't about forgetting. Today was about being seen. She took a deep breath and knocked. The sound echoed, and for a moment, nothing happened. Katie adjusted her coat, smoothing down the hem of her favorite lavender dress. She glanced at her reflection in the glass window to the left of the door, catching the soft waves of her auburn hair and the light blush on her cheeks. Her makeup was simple, but she wanted to feel radiant today. She wanted to look like herself. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing her mother's familiar face. For a second, Mrs. Holloway just stood there, her hand clutching the edge of the doorframe. Her eyes widened, flickering with recognition and surprise, but something warmer bloomed beneath the surface. "Katie," her mother whispered, as though saying the name aloud might shatter the fragile moment. Katie nodded, tears welling up despite her efforts to keep them at bay. "Hi, Mom." Before she could say more, her mother closed the gap, pulling her into a tight embrace. The scent of lavender soap and baked apples enveloped Katie, a mixture so deeply familiar it sent her spiraling into memories of childhood. She melted into the hug, letting the tears fall freely now. "Oh, my sweet girl," her mother murmured, stroking Katie's hair. "You're home." Katie hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words until that moment. Dinner at the Holloway household hadn't changed much. The large oak dining table was still set with mismatched plates, the ones Katie's dad refused to replace because they were part of the family. The soft hum of the kitchen fan and the clinking of silverware provided a gentle backdrop as Katie sat across from her parents, her nerves slightly less raw but still present. Her father hadn't said much when she arrived. He'd greeted her with a nod, his usual stoic demeanor masking whatever he might have been feeling. She tried not to overanalyze it. "So," her mother said, setting a bowl of mashed potatoes on the table. "How have you been?" "Really?" Katie glanced down at her plate, her appetite fleeting. She had rehearsed this conversation in her head countless times, but now that it was happening, words seemed elusive. "I've been better," she admitted, her voice softer than she intended. "But it's been a journey." Her mother reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on Katie's. "We're so proud of you. For everything." Her father cleared his throat, and Katie looked up, bracing herself. "Does it make you happy?" he asked, his voice gruff but steady. Katie blinked, caught off guard by the question. She took a moment to think, letting the weight of her father's words settle. "Yes," she said finally. "For the first time in my life, I feel like me. Like I'm not pretending anymore." Her father nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he said, "That's all that matters." The tension that had gripped Katie's chest loosened. She felt a flicker of hope, a small but significant crack in the wall she'd always felt between them. Katie's journey to this moment hadn't been easy. Growing up in a small, conservative town, she had always felt like an outsider. As a child, she'd sneak into her mother's closet, trying on dresses and twirling in front of the mirror when no one was watching. Those moments were her escape, a fleeting taste of the person she longed to be. But they were always followed by guilt and fear, a heavy weight that settled in her chest as she shoved the dresses back into place and returned to being Kevin. High school was a blur of trying to fit in, of suppressing the truth and pretending to be someone she wasn't. She played sports, dated girls, and did everything she thought was expected of her, all while hiding the growing ache inside. It wasn't until college, far from the watchful eyes of her hometown, that Katie began to explore who she truly was. She found solace in online forums and support groups, connecting with others who shared her experiences. Slowly, she started to piece together her identity, like assembling a puzzle she hadn't realized was missing pieces. But coming out to her family had been a different kind of challenge. She had rehearsed the conversation for weeks, writing and rewriting every word. When she finally called her parents, her voice trembling as she told them she was transgender. The line had gone silent. Her mother had been the first to speak. "We'll always love you," she'd said, though Katie could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Her father had said little, and for months after, their conversations were stilted and awkward. Katie feared she had lost them, that her truth had created a rift too wide to mend. But then her mother started calling more often, asking questions about Katie's life and even watching videos about transgender experiences. Slowly, the walls began to come down. And now, sitting at the family dinner table, Katie felt the beginnings of something she hadn't dared to hope for: acceptance. After dinner, Katie and her mother sat on the porch, sipping tea as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of pink and orange, the kind of sunset Katie used to dream about when she felt trapped in her old life. "I was scared," her mother admitted, breaking the silence. "When you told us, I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know how to help you." Katie nodded, her fingers wrapped around the warm mug. "I was scared too. I didn't know if you'd still want me in your life." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Katie, we've always wanted you in our lives. We just needed time to understand." Katie reached out, taking her mother's hand. "Thank you for trying, for being here." Her mother smiled, a soft, bittersweet expression. "You're my daughter, Katie. That's all that matters." The next morning, Katie found her father in the garage, tinkering with his old fishing gear. She hesitated in the doorway, unsure if she was intruding, but he glanced up and waved her in. "Morning," he said, his tone casual. "Morning," Katie replied, stepping closer. They worked in silence for a while, Katie watching as her father meticulously sorted hooks and lures. Finally, he spoke. "You were always good at figuring things out," he said, not looking up. "When you were a kid, you'd spend hours trying to solve those puzzles your mom got you. Drove me crazy sometimes." Katie chuckled softly. "I remember." Her father set down a reel and turned to face her. "I guess what I'm saying is, I see that same determination in you now, and I respect it. I'm proud of you, Katie." The words hit Katie like a wave, overwhelming in their simplicity. She felt tears prick her eyes and quickly wiped them away, a small laugh escaping her lips. "Thank you, Dad," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're my kid. That hasn't changed." As the days passed, Katie began to feel a sense of belonging she hadn't thought possible. Her parents didn't just tolerate her, they embraced her, flaws and all. They asked questions, made mistakes, and tried again. One evening, as they sat around the fireplace sharing stories, Katie realized she was no longer holding her breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. For the first time in years, she felt at home. And as she looked around at the people who had once seemed so far away, she knew she had finally found her place. She was Katie, their daughter, and she was loved. She was home. The following week passed in a blur of small, tender moments that Katie found herself treasuring more than she ever thought she would. Her mother, always a perfectionist in the kitchen, enlisted Katie's help in baking her favorite pumpkin pie. As they sifted flour and rolled out the dough, Katie realized how rare it was for the two of them to spend uninterrupted time together. Her mother seemed to realize it too. "I've been reading a lot about people's journeys," her mother said, her voice hesitant but kind. "It's helped me understand a little better. But honestly, I'm still learning." Katie smiled, dusting her hands on the apron tied around her waist. "You don't have to know everything. Just trying means the world to me." Her mother paused, her hands buried in the pie dough. "I regret that it took me so long to get here. I've been thinking about those years when you were younger, and I wish I'd seen the signs. Maybe I could have made things easier for you." Katie's chest tightened. "You couldn't have known, Mom. I barely understood it myself back then." She reached out, placing a flowery hand over her mother's. "What matters is now. And now I feel like you're really seeing me. That's more than I could have hoped for." Her mother's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away, chuckling softly. "We're going to ruin this pie if I keep crying all over it." Katie laughed, And for the first time in years, it felt like the laughter came from a place of genuine joy. One afternoon, Katie decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. She hadn't walked these streets in years, and the familiarity of it all felt almost surreal. The old oak trees lining the sidewalk were still there, their branches sprawling overhead like they were reaching out to touch the sky. She passed the playground where she'd spent so many afternoons as a kid, climbing the monkey bars and pretending she was fearless. But she hadn't been fearless. Back then, she'd been terrified of herself, of the world, of the truth that she'd buried so deep inside that even she couldn't fully face it. The sound of children's laughter brought her back to the present. A group of kids raced across the grass, their shrieks of delight echoing in the air. Katie smiled, watching them for a moment before continuing on. As she rounded the corner, she saw Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who had lived 2 houses down from her family for as long as she could remember. Mrs. Peterson was tending to her flower garden, her wide-brimmed hat shielding her face from the sun. "Katie, is that you?" the woman called, squinting as she looked up. Katie froze for a moment, startled that Mrs. Peterson recognized her so quickly. Then she smiled and walked over. "Hi, Mrs. Peterson. It's been a long time." The older woman straightened, brushing dirt off her hands. "It sure has. You've grown into such a beautiful young lady." Katie blinked, taken aback by the casual compliment. "Thank you," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. Mrs. Peterson tilted her head, studying Katie with a kind but curious expression. "You always did have a good head on your shoulders. Your parents must be so proud of you." Katie felt a lump rise in her throat. "They've been amazing. I wasn't sure how they'd react, but they've been trying so hard to support me." Mrs. Peterson smiled warmly. "Good parents always find a way to show their love. And you, my dear, deserve all the love in the world." Katie didn't realize how much she needed to hear those words until that moment. Back at home, Katie found her father in the living room, staring intently at a stack of old photo albums spread out on the coffee table. She hesitated in the doorway, unsure if she should interrupt, but he looked up and waved her over. "Take a look at these," he said, patting the empty spot on the couch beside him. Katie sat down, glancing at the album he was flipping through. It was one of the older ones, filled with photos from her childhood. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a picture of her as a little boy, grinning widely as she held up a fishing rod. "You caught that trout all by yourself. You must have been, 7?" Katie smiled faintly, remembering the day. "I was so proud of that fish. You let me gut it, even though I made a mess." Her father chuckled. "Yeah, your mother wasn't too happy about that." They turned another page, and Katie's breath caught. There was a photo of her in her first Halloween costume, a princess dress she'd begged her parents to let her wear. At the time, they'd laughed it off, thinking it was just a phase. But for Katie, it had been one of the happiest moments of her young life. Her father's expression softened as he looked at the picture. "You were so happy that day." "I remember thinking it was just a kid being a kid. But now, I see it differently." Katie glanced at him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "It's okay, Dad. You couldn't have known." He nodded slowly. "I know, but I want you to know that I'm proud of you, Katie, for being brave enough to live your truth. I can't imagine how hard it's been, but you've handled it with more strength than I ever could have mustered." Katie felt tears prick her eyes again. "Thank you," she whispered. They sat in silence for a while, flipping through more photos and sharing memories. For the first time, Katie felt like her father wasn't just seeing the past, but also embracing the person she had become. That evening, Katie decided to share something she'd been working on for months. After dinner, she brought out a small notebook and placed it on the table. "What's this?" her mother asked, picking it up. "It's kind of a journal," Katie explained, her cheeks flushing. "I started writing in it when I began my transition. It helped me process everything I was feeling." Her mother flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting and the occasional doodle in the margins. "This is beautiful, Katie. Would you mind if we read some of it?" Katie hesitated. The journal was deeply personal, filled with raw emotions and intimate thoughts. But she realized that sharing it might help her parents understand her journey even more.
"Go ahead," she said, nodding.
Her mother began reading aloud, her voice trembling slightly as she recited passages about Katie's struggles with self-acceptance, her fears of rejection, and her moments of joy when she finally started to see herself in the mirror. Her father listened intently, his brow furrowed but his eyes filled with something Katie could only describe as love. When her mother finished, she set the notebook down and reached across the table to squeeze Katie's hand. "Thank you for sharing this with us. It's a gift, Katie. You're a gift." Katie smiled through her tears, feeling a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. The next morning, as Katie packed her bags to return to her apartment in the city, her parents stood in the doorway of her childhood bedroom. "You'll come back soon, won't you?" her mother asked, her voice tinged with both hope and worry. "Of course," Katie said, smiling. "This is my home, after all." Her father stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "And it always will be, no matter what." Katie hugged them both tightly, feeling a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible. As she drove away, the town disappearing in her rearview mirror, she realized that this wasn't just a visit. It was a homecoming, a true one. For the first time, Katie knew she wasn't leaving behind a family that tolerated her. She was leaving behind a family that loved her unconditionally, and that love would carry her through whatever challenges lay ahead. Thank you so much for watching till now. It means the world to have you here. This community is all about empowering each other and celebrating the incredible journeys of everyone on their path to living authentically. If you're ever feeling lost or alone, remember you have a whole family here for you. Hit that subscribe button, smash that like button, and let's keep inspiring each other, sending you all the love and strength in the world. Until next time, live your life by your rules.